NG's ഓൺലൈൻ്റെ പുതിയൊരു വീഡിയോയിലേക്ക് എല്ലാവർക്കും സ്വാഗതം. സോ നമ്മൾ ഇന്ന് ഈ ഒരു വീഡിയോയിൽ നോക്കാൻ പോകുന്നത് സെമസ്റ്റർ 6 BA ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൻ്റെ വുമൺസ് റൈറ്റിംഗ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന പേപ്പറുമായിട്ട് ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട ബ്രേക്കിംഗ് ദ സൈലൻസ് ആൻഡ് ആന്തോളജി ഓഫ് വുമൺസ് ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ എന്ന ടെക്സ്റ്റിലെ ഫസ്റ്റ് സെക്ഷൻ, അതായത് എസ്സേസിൻ്റെ സെക്ഷനിലെ ഫസ്റ്റ് ചാപ്റ്റർ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഫസ്റ്റ് എസ്സേ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഷേക്സ്പിയർ ആൻഡ് ഹിസ് സിസ്റ്റേഴ്സ് ബൈ വെർജീനിയ വൂൾഫ്. വെർജീനിയ വൂൾഫിൻ്റെ വളരെ ഫേമസ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള എ റൂം ഓഫ് വൺസ് ഓൺ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ആ ഒരു എസ്സേയിൽ നിന്ന് എടുത്തിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ചെറിയൊരു പാർട്ടാണ് ദ ഷേക്സ്പിയർ ആൻഡ് ഹിസ് സിസ്റ്റേഴ്സ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ള ഈ ഒരു എസ്സേ. സോ ഈ ഒരു എസ്സേ നമുക്ക് ജസ്റ്റ് ഒന്ന് വായിച്ചു പോവുകയാണ് ഈ ഒരു വീഡിയോയിൽ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. സോ നമുക്ക് ആ ഒരു ആദ്യത്തെ ഫസ്റ്റ് സെമസ്റ്ററിനകത്ത് നമ്മൾ പഠിച്ചു തുടങ്ങിയത് തന്നെ എന്താണ്, ലാംഗ്വേജ് സ്കിൽസ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് എന്താണ്, നമ്മൾ ഓരോരോ കാര്യങ്ങളും എന്ത് ചെയ്യുക, വായിക്കുക അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ലിസൺ ചെയ്യുക, എന്നിട്ട് അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് പഠിക്കുക എന്നൊക്കെയുള്ള രീതിയിലാണ് നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്നത്. സോ നമ്മൾ ഈ ഒരു വീഡിയോയിനകത്ത് നമ്മൾ ഈ ഒരു ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഒന്ന് വായിക്കുകയാണ്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഈ ഒരു എസ്സേ ഒന്ന് വായിക്കുകയാണ്. സോ എന്ത് ചെയ്യുക, എല്ലാവരും ശ്രദ്ധിക്കുക, ലിസൺ ചെയ്യുക. ലിസൺ ചെയ്ത ശേഷം നിങ്ങളുടെ കയ്യിൽ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എടുത്തൊന്ന് വായിച്ചു നോക്കുക, എന്നിട്ട് അടുത്ത ക്ലാസ്സുകളിലേക്ക് വരിക. സോ ചാനൽ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നത് സബ്സ്ക്രൈബ് ചെയ്യുക, നിങ്ങളുടെ മറ്റു സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾക്ക് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യുക, നിങ്ങളുടെ അഭിപ്രായങ്ങൾ കമൻറ്റ് ചെയ്യുക.
Shakespeare and his sister. From a room of one's own. Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf, 1882 to 1941, is a prolific writer of the 20th century. Ranked by critics among the modernists, she is the first woman writer who has adopted a female aesthetic for her writings. She belonged to the Bloomsbury Group and ran the Hogarth Press along with her husband, Leonard Woolf. Her novels, To the Lighthouse, 3 Guineas and Mrs. Dalloway show her dexterity as a writer of artful poetic prose. In October 1928, Woolf was invited by the Arts Society of Newnham College and the Otta at Girton College to deliver 2 lectures on women in fiction. She considered her visit as part of a continuing struggle for women's empowerment. These lectures have later given shape to the book titled A Room of One's Own, 1929, in which she reconstructs the cultural and literary history of women writers and the socio-political conditions in which these women have written. In the given excerpt, Woolf, by means of her unique imaginative skill, creates a fictional sister for Shakespeare called Judith Shakespeare, who is deprived of access to cultural and intellectual domains. Woolf is provoked by a declaration made by a bishop that it was impossible for any woman, past, present or to come, to have the genius of Shakespeare. As clarification, he added that cats do not as a matter of fact go to heaven, though they have souls of a sort. Woolf structures these statements logically: cats do not go to heaven. Women cannot write the plays of Shakespeare. These strange propositions haunt her so much that she engages in a highly critical banter which exposes the double standards maintained in the society and the unequal treatment meted out to women. Be that as it may, I could not help thinking, as I looked at the works of Shakespeare on the shelf, that the bishop was right at least in this: it would have been impossible, completely and entirely, for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister, called Judith, let us say. Shakespeare himself went, very probably his mother was an heiress, to the grammar school, where he may have learnt Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace and the elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had, rather sooner than he should have done, to marry a woman in the neighborhood, who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. He had, it seemed, a taste for the theatre. He began by holding horses at the stage door. Very soon he got work in the theatre, became a successful actor, and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, exercising his wits in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the Queen. Meanwhile his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was. But she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew and not moon about with books and papers. They would have spoken sharply but kindly, for they were substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. Indeed, more likely than not she was the apple of her father's eye. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in an apple loft on the sly, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them. Soon, however, before she was out of her teens, she was to be betrothed to the son of a neighboring wool stapler. She cried out that marriage was hateful to her, and for that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to shame him in this matter of her marriage. He would give her a chain of beads or a fine petticoat, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? The force of her own gift alone drove her to it. She made up a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by a rope one summer's night and took the road to London. She was not 17. The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was. She had the quickest fancy, a gift like her brother's, for the tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for the theatre. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose-lipped man, guffawed. He bellowed something about poodles dancing and women. Acting, no woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted you can imagine what. She could get no training in her craft. Could she even seek her dinner in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight? Yet her genius was for fiction and lust to feed abundantly upon the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. At last, for she was very young, oddly like Shakespeare the poet in her face, with the same grey eyes and rounded brows, at last Nick Green the actor-manager took pity on her. She found herself with child by that gentleman, and so who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught entangled in a woman's body? Killed herself one winter's night and lies buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle. That, more or less, is how the story would run, I think, if a woman in Shakespeare's day had had Shakespeare's genius. But for my part, I agree with the deceased bishop. If such he was, it is unthinkable that any woman in Shakespeare's day should have had Shakespeare's genius. For genius like Shakespeare's is not born among laboring, uneducated, servile people. It was not born in England among the Saxons and the Britons. It is not born today among the working classes. How, then, could it have been born among women whose work began, according to Professor Trevelyan, almost before they were out of the nursery, who were forced to it by their parents and held to it by all the power of law and custom? Yet genius of a sort must have existed among women as it must have existed among the working classes. Now and again an Emily Bronte or a Robert Burns blazes out and proves its presence. But certainly it never got itself onto paper. When, however, one reads of a witch being ducked, of a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even of a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mute and inglorious Jane Austen, some Emily Bronte who dashed her brains out on the moor or mopped and mowed about the highways crazed with the torture that her gift had put her to. Indeed, I would venture to guess that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. It was a woman, Edward Fitzgerald, I think, suggested, who made the ballads and the folk songs, crooning them to her children, beguiling her spinning with them, or the length of the winter's night. This may be true or it may be false, who can say? But what is true in it, so it seemed to me, reviewing the story of Shakespeare's sister as I had made it, is that any woman born with a great gift in the 16th century would certainly have gone crazed, shot herself, or ended her days in some lonely cottage outside the village, half witch, half wizard, feared and mocked at. For it needs little skill in psychology to be sure that a highly gifted girl, who had tried to use her gift for poetry, would have been so thwarted and hindered by other people, so tortured and pulled asunder by her own contrary instincts, that she must have lost her health and sanity to a certainty. No girl could have walked to London and stood at a stage door and forced her way into the presence of actor-managers without doing herself a violence and suffering an anguish which may have been irrational, for chastity may be a fetish invented by certain societies for unknown reasons, but were nonetheless inevitable. Chastity had then, it has even now, a religious importance in woman's life, and has so wrapped itself round with nerves and instincts that to cut it free and bring it to the light of day demands courage of the rarest. To have lived a free life in London in the 16th century would have meant for a woman who was poet and playwright a nervous stress and dilemma which might well have killed her. Had she survived, whatever she had written would have been twisted and deformed, issuing from a strained and morbid imagination. And undoubtedly, I thought, looking at the shelf where there are no plays by women, her work would have gone unsigned. That refuge she would have sought certainly. It was the relic of the sense of chastity that dictated anonymity to women even so late in the 19th century. Clara Bell, George Eliot, George Sand, all the victims of inner strife, as their writings prove, sought ineffectively to veil themselves by using the name of a man. Thus they did homage to the convention, which if not implanted by the other sex was liberally encouraged by them. The chief glory of a woman is not to be talked of, said Pericles, himself a much talked of man. That publicity in women is detestable. Anonymity runs in their blood. The desire to be veiled still possesses them. They are not even now as concerned about the health of their fame as men are, and, speaking generally, will pass a tombstone or a signpost without feeling an irresistible desire to cut their names on it, as Alf, Bert, or Chas must do in obedience to their instinct, which murmurs if it sees a fine woman go by, or even a dog, S6M1E1P1. And, of course, it may not be a dog, I thought, remembering Parliament Square, the Sieges Alley and other avenues. It may be a piece of land or a man with curly black hair. It is one of the great advantages of being a woman that one can pass even a very fine negress without wishing to make an Englishwoman of her. That woman, then, who was born with a gift of poetry in the 16th century, was an unhappy woman, a woman at strife against herself. All the conditions of her life, all her own instincts, were hostile to the state of mind which is needed to set free whatever is in the brain. But what is the state of mind that is most propitious to the act of creation? I asked. Can one come by any notion of the state that furthers and makes possible that strange activity? Here I opened the volume containing the tragedies of Shakespeare. What was Shakespeare's state of mind, for instance, when he wrote Lear and Antony and Cleopatra? It was certainly the state of mind most favorable to poetry that there has ever existed. But Shakespeare himself said nothing about it. We only know casually and by chance that he never blotted a line. Nothing indeed was ever said by the artist himself about his state of mind until the 18th century perhaps. Rousseau perhaps began it. At any rate, by the 19th century self-consciousness had developed so far that it was the habit for men of letters to describe their minds in confessions and autobiographies. Their lives also were written, and their letters were printed after their deaths. Thus, though we do not know what Shakespeare went through when he wrote Lear, we do know what Carlyle went through when he wrote the French Revolution, what Flaubert went through when he wrote Madame Bovary, what Keats was going through when he tried to write poetry against the coming of death and the indifference of the world. And one gathers from this enormous modern literature of confession and self-analysis that to write a work of genius is almost always a feat of prodigious difficulty. Everything is against the likelihood that it will come from the writer's mind whole and entire. Generally, material circumstances are against it. Dogs will bark, people will interrupt, money must be made, health will break down. Further, accentuating all these difficulties and making them harder to bear is the world's notorious indifference. It does not care whether Flaubert finds the right word or whether Carlyle scrupulously verifies this or that fact. Naturally, it will not pay for what it does not want. And so the writer, Keats, Flaubert, Carlyle, suffers, especially in the creative years of youth, every form of distraction and discouragement. A curse, a cry of agony, rises from those books of analysis and confession. Mighty poets in their misery dead, that is the burden of their song. If anything comes through, in spite of all this, it is a miracle, and probably no book is born entire and uncrippled as it was conceived. But for women, I thought, looking at the empty shelves, these difficulties were infinitely more formidable. In the first place, to have a room of her own, let alone a quiet room or a soundproof room, was out of the question, unless her parents were exceptionally rich or very noble, even up to the beginning of the 19th century. Since her pin money, which depended on the goodwill of her father, was only enough to keep her clothed, she was debarred from such alleviations as came even to Keats or Tennyson or Carlyle, all poor men, from a walking tour, a little journey to France, from the separate lodging which, even if it were miserable enough, sheltered them from the claims and tyrannies of their families. Such material difficulties were formidable, but much worse were the immaterial. The indifference of the world which Keats and Flaubert and other men of genius have found so hard to bear was in her case not indifference but hostility. The world did not say to her as it said to them, "Write if you choose, it makes no difference to me." The world said with a guffaw, "Write? What's the good of your writing?" Here the psychologists of Newnham and Girton might come to our help, I thought, looking again at the blank spaces on the shelves. Thus I concluded, that even in the 19th century a woman was not encouraged to be an artist. On the contrary, she was snubbed, slapped, lectured and exhorted. Her mind must have been strained and her vitality lowered the need of opposing this, of disproving that. For though we say that we know nothing about Shakespeare's state of mind even as we say that, we are saying something about Shakespeare's state of mind. The reason perhaps why we know so little of Shakespeare compared with Donne or Ben Jonson or Milton, is that his grudges and spites and antipathies are hidden from us. We are not held up by some revelation, which reminds us of the writer. All desire to protest, to preach, to proclaim an injury, to pay off a score, to make the world the witness of some hardship or grievance that was fired out of him and consumed. Therefore his poetry flows from him free and unimpeded. If ever a human being got his work expressed completely, it was Shakespeare. If ever a mind was incandescent, unimpeded, I thought, turning again to the bookcase, it was Shakespeare's mind.